So thank you very much. I really want to extend a special thanks to Charan, who I've known for some time. I have to say that this is the kind of audience I enjoy the most because you're young, you have ideas, and you're looking forward to changing the world in some way or the other. So I'm very, very happy to be here. And I just want to say that India is really at a crossroad where lots of interesting, fascinating things are happening, and it's really good to see all of you being part of it. So what I bring to you is a paper that I co-authored with my colleagues at the IMF. And this paper, just to let you know, became a little controversial, and you'll see why. And you'll see why it generated a lot of interest. It was covered in many newspapers, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times. And the motivation of this paper came really from the financial crisis of 2008 that had happened, which took everybody by surprise. So what went wrong, and what are the lessons? So that's the motivation. So really underlying this, there is a paper, and I think in the presentation, which I think, Sharon, at some point you will put up, there is there's a link at the IMF to the paper that we had written. So you might find it useful to read the paper. But even more importantly, one of the things we are doing is for academics, researchers, analysts like yourselves, we have provided all the data. So you can access all the data that underlies the analysis we've done. So this data covers a number of countries, as you will see. So let me get to the motivation. So as I said, the one lesson was a question of what are the lessons that can be drawn for emerging markets from the crisis, as I just mentioned. Another question that we asked is a very fundamental one. We know financial sectors became very big, but do we have good measures of financial sector? How do you measure? What do you mean by financial sector? What is a good measure? And traditionally, the measures that have been used are really how much is private credit coming from banks to the economy. We said it's not seeming the right way to go about answering this question. So we said, and this whole research project got delayed by almost a year because I told my team, I said, you know what, we have to start afresh. I don't think we have the right measure. So then, because at the IMF we have 189 member countries, and one of the biggest advantages we have is getting data from these countries for over long periods of time. So we said, why don't we come up with a sensible measure? So that's one of the things we did, and we said, and you'll see what that is. And then once we had this measure, we asked this question, having seen the 2008 crisis, which is, is there a trade-off really between financial development, and I'll show you some pictures, how fast financial sector grew in advanced economies, and financial stability. So is it that if you become too big, it becomes unstable? And a related question we asked is it just the size that matters, or is it that you develop too fast, you grow too fast, and that creates the instability? And then, as a side issue, we asked also this question, because there's so much debate, is it because countries had more foreign banks than domestic banks? Because when things go bad, the foreign banks shut up, leave, they send capital out of the country. Is that one of the reasons why it leads to more crises? That's on the negative side. But on the positive side, they also bring benefits. And they can bring benefits like capital. They bring capital, as you know. They bring know-how. So we asked the question, does it matter, both for financial development as well as for financial stability? And then, of course, a very important question where the IMF very much participates in setting and in contributing to the global reform agenda through discussions at the Financial Stability Board, which is based in Basel, is there a role for regulation then if indeed financial instability occurs if financial sector becomes too big? So those are the main topics. So just to give you some background, just to tell you something about the literature, during the 1970s and the 1980s, researchers were struggling with just coming up with a conceptual framework. So the conceptual framework, initially, the ideas were put forward by people like McKinnon and Shaw, and what they argued was that financial repression can hurt growth. By financial repression, one means the implication being that interest rates are deliberately kept very low. It also may mean, as in this country actually, you have statutory liquidity requirements where banks may be required to hold government bonds. What that does is then it doesn't allow enough credit then to go to the private sector if you're holding government bonds. So those are some ideas. So why does it matter? Why does it matter if interest rates are low or controlled? And the answer is, if interest rates are too low, people are not going to save as much. And if they don't save as much, then investment is not going to be as much. And why will investment not be as much? Because, as you know well, the savers are not necessarily the best people who do the most productive investments. That's why you need banks to intermediate. So if you don't have enough savings, you won't have enough resources for the people who do have the skills to invest and can put it to more productive uses. So that was kind of the motivation where they argued that actually financial sector development helps growth. So that was the basic thesis. And then comes the 1990s, where it really picked up the idea of going from a conceptual framework to actually looking at empirical work. They said, okay, you can give all this theory, but show me the facts. So there was a lot of research, empirical research being done, where they showed that, of course, by looking at the two measures that I mentioned, especially private credit to GDP ratio, they found that there is indeed a positive relationship between financial development and growth, and financial development basically being measured by private credit or credit to the private sector. And Ross Levine was quite well known in this area, and then he tried to systematize a little bit more to argue why finance matters or financial system matters. And there are some of them you're going to be very familiar with it, so it's just like giving you a list of why it matters. So an obvious one is, of course, if you have banks or the stock market or bonds, it eases the exchange between different parties, also of goods and services. It helps mobilize savings. We already talked about that. It helps allocate capital to the most productive users. It facilitates trade. It allows diversification. It also is a good risk management tool, because as people, when you save, you can keep some for the rainy day when you need to take it out because somebody is sick, because you want to build a house, whatever. And then, of course, it's also the case that when you develop markets and there are prices, the prices like stock market, the bonds, interest rates, they gave very important signals to different participants about which way the aggregate economy is going, but also individual companies. And then finally, it's also a way of actually exerting corporate control, because if you're not doing very well in your business, stock prices of your share values of your company is going to go down, and then the shareholders are going to come back and say, what's going on? So anyway, so that was the story. So until the 1990s, bottom line, and there's a chart that shows the 3 bars there tell you that if there is low depth, again measured by private credit, what the average growth rate would look like, medium and high. And it was unambiguous. Higher depth meant higher growth, bottom line. Then come post-1990s. And then as researchers continued to look at this issue, they were finding that actually this relationship, this monotonous relationship, positive relationship, linear, was breaking down. It was no longer holding true. In fact, it was not holding true across regions, across countries, across time. And they said, wow, so these results are not robust. What the heck is going on? And that's where I would say is the main contribution that our paper makes. So let me get to that. So again, this chart is simply going to tell you the main thing I'm going to argue is the bank-related measures, like deposits, like bank credit, are simply not good measures of financial development. Why? Because if you look at this chart on the x-axis simply measures GDP per capita. We just took a log of it. Okay? That's on the x-axis. On the y-axis, there are several measures of capital market development. Okay? So what we did there is we said, let's look at, just to give you an example, the value of domestic private bonds. We took that and we said, let's look at it relative to how big the banking system is. So one measure is total deposits. So all we have done is taken different measures of the financial sector, private bond market, stock market, public bond market, pensions, mutual funds, and we have divided each of those values by the value of the deposits. That's all. So in a way, all we are doing is we are comparing how big each of these markets are relative to the banks. So as you will see in this chart, let me point to 3 things of this chart. First, when you look at those lines, it's very clear that as the economy grows and the per capita income grows, most of these lines are, basically going up. Means as income grows, per capita income grows, the non-bank part of the economy grows. Very simple fact. So that's number 1. Number 2, actually at very high levels of per capita income, or as the income grows, the shaded region basically shows, that the private bond market and the stock market have become much more important than banks, because that ratio is higher than 1. That's a simple thing. But the third thing is, while all these variables, and this is based on a number of countries across time, all these variables are increasing, the only one that falls a little bit is the public bond market. So this is just showing you some stylized facts. But the bottom line of this chart is it just tells you that you can't just look at banks. You've got to look at everything else. Then the next chart is, at least we found it even more convincing when we looked at the data. So on the left-hand side is a measure for the US. Okay? So what we did is we looked at from 1980 to the most recent data that we had, and we said, let's look at the bank credit to private sector. And very interesting, what you see is the bank credit to private sector as a share of GDP is more or less constant. It hasn't really moved. But then if you look at the total assets of banks as well as non-banks, that has completely ballooned. So anybody who was doing research only by looking at bank credit to private sector would have completely missed the crisis, would have never known that the financial sector has grown so much. So this is another reason why we need to measure financial development in a very different way. And then the right-hand chart, that basically just tells you that just by looking at depth, by depth I mean some value of a financial variable, maybe normalized by the GDP, is not good enough, because financial development should also be inclusive, for example. It should also be efficient. So this is simply a chart which says that when you look at 100, so we have bank credit to private sector on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is a measure of financial inclusion. And what you see there is Vietnam and Australia, for example, and there are other countries, they have the same ratio of bank credit to private sector to GDP, but very different levels of financial inclusion. So we claim that Australia is much more advanced, more developed than Vietnam, even though if you just looked at bank credit, you would say they are at similar levels of development. So let me give you the bottom line of what I'm going to present. So what are the two main contributions of our paper is really first to come up actually with a measure of financial development. And the second one is to look at the relationship between financial development and economic growth, but also financial and economic stability. So what do we find? What do we find? Give you the bottom line and then I'll go through it. The first thing we find is, if you ask the question, is there a positive contribution of financial development to growth? The answer is still yes, broadly. Yeah, sure. The second is, at very high levels of financial development, does this relationship break down? And we find that yes, beyond a point, loosely speaking, there's too much finance. So basically, what we do is we look at about 186 countries, okay, of which 26 countries are advanced economies, 89 are emerging markets, and 71 are low-income countries. So we try to compute a broad-based measure. This broad-based measure looks at two aspects, markets and institutions. And within markets and institutions, we look at three things: depth, access, and efficiency for both institutions and market. And then when I talk about institutions, what I mean is banks, insurance companies, mutual funds, pension funds. In terms of financial markets, we look at stocks and bonds. So what we try to do is we look at each indicator within each of these categories, and then we rank the countries. And then we normalize it to 0 to 1. And then we do a weighted average. And it's a complicated econometric exercise we conduct, but basically we do a principal component analysis, and we then weight each of the indicators by, we call it squared factor loading, so that the weights then reflect the importance of each of these indicators. So bottom line is we come up with an aggregate indicator, and then we look at it and we say, okay, using our indicator, let's see what our data tells us. And it was really interesting and reassuring that our data actually tells a very interesting story. And it is consistent with what you might expect. So on the x-axis, you have years starting in 1980. Y-axis is our index. And what we find is that indeed, first, over time, whether they are emerging markets, which is blue line, or advanced economies, which is green line, or low-income countries, yellow line, over time, financial sector has developed over time for all the three regions. Second, as you would expect, it's much higher for advanced economies than for emerging markets and low-income countries. But the third observation, which is really very interesting, is between 1992 and 2006-7, it's amazing how fast the advanced economies financial sector grew. And that basically came because of huge deregulation in the financial markets, both in the US as well as in Europe. And then comes 2008 crash, and as you will see, suddenly you see the financial sector shrinking in 2008, right here, which is also consistent with our belief and what we observe, which is there was deleveraging or shrinking of the size because a number of them got hit. Then when you look at just these indices, I'm just using these indices to look at compare different regions, financial institutions and financial markets. So ignore the third part, which is the overall rating. Again, as you will see, the blue, which is the advanced, the green is emerging markets, and brown is the low income. The first observation is advanced economies, of course, even in the sub-indices, financial institutions and financial markets are much more developed than the other two, as you would expect. And that holds for financial institutions and markets. But what is really interesting is just focus on financial institutions' efficiency. This one. We were really surprised to see, because we always felt, somehow emerging markets and low-income countries were more inefficient. The answer was no, they were much closer to the advanced economies. What the real difference was on depth and access. So that was a surprise to us. And of course, from there we took the message that it would be important to increase the depth of, it would be important to increase the access in both. For example, here you will see that China and Brazil actually are much more developed than, say, Portugal. And then here you'll see Bangladesh and Kenya are much more developed than Ecuador, which is an emerging market. So this is just to show you some data. So let's look at what are the costs and benefits of financial development. So this is basically, they can't hear properly? Oh, okay. It just looks like that? Okay. Can you hear me better? Oh, you should have told me earlier. But could you hear me at all before that? Okay. Okay. Well, it's good you told me, because this to me, if you have to remember anything about this presentation, this is the chart that I want you to remember. So you did it absolutely at the right time. So let me explain a little bit what this chart is. It's a very simple chart, actually. On the x-axis, it's our measure of financial development index. And on the y-axis is what is the effect, we ask the question, what is the effect on the growth rate as you develop more financially? And so we actually run a very complicated regression with controls. So this is not just a simple correlation between financial development and growth. We control for initial conditions, policy variables that include education, FDI, trade, government spending, also control for crises. So we try to be very careful to establish some causality between financial development and growth, to ask the question, really, how does financial development affect growth? And as you may recall, up until the 1990s, they found that the relationship was just one way, meaning until the 1990s, basically there was a straight line, more or less, between financial development and growth. When we now look at all the data of all these countries, what is really interesting is we find that beyond a certain point where you see Poland, the effect on growth begins to decline. So basically, growth is still positive, but at the margin it begins to fall. And then there comes a point much later on where actually it hurts growth, so that the growth becomes negative, completely negative. But even so, if you look at between Poland and Japan, actually what it's telling you is that there's no point in increasing your financial sector any bigger, because it's actually hurting growth. Your growth is coming down. So this chart is the one that all these newspapers carried, because the financial sector there, which is very powerful, they said this cannot be, there must be something not right, because how can financial sector just by its growth hurt financial stability or growth. So that's an issue that we started to explore. Very important to point out that this shaded region here, all that it says is that yes, the point at which growth begins to fall is when financial development index is at 0.5, literally half. But we cannot say that that's true for every country. Okay? It depends on the initial conditions, it depends on the peculiarities of the country. So what we can say is that we are 95% sure that this turning point occurs between 0.4 and 0.7. That's all we can say. But we are 95% sure, but this range is very wide. It's between 0.4 and 0.7. Okay? So India is, of course, within that range. So it doesn't necessarily mean that for India that turning point has occurred. But then we start to ask this question, so why is this happening? What is the big deal? Why is there a turning point? Why does the financial sector development actually hurt growth? And some people argued, maybe because if it becomes too big, there may be too many booms or busts. That's one reason. Another reason is, and this should strike home with you, there might be too much of diversion of really top talent to go to and work in the financial sector rather than in the real sector, rather than in manufacturing and other services sector, because the compensation of that financial sector is high, and of course it attracts more people and it becomes even bigger. A third reason is when financial services increase, there may be what we call greater rent extraction by the financial sector from the rest of the economy. What do I mean by that? Just to give you an example, asset management companies charge huge fees to provide a service, to manage your wealth, to help a company. How much use is that to actually real production in the economy? These are just some questions. Also, if financial sector becomes very big, then people start to borrow a lot. They become leveraged. They tend to save less because they can live off borrowing. But that creates also some instability. And of course, when money is very easy, when you can borrow easily, it leads to excessive risk taking. So bottom line is that if financial sector becomes too big, it can lead to a waste and misallocation of resources. It can also lead to a loss of corporate control. So that was on growth. So this is on stability. Now, here the question is, how can financial development affect stability? So the answer is, on the plus side, you can say that the positive aspect of financial development is it helps you smooth consumption because you can save, use it for a rainy day. It also reduces the credit constraints, so it allows companies to borrow and then rather than use their own profits and invest. It allows for risk sharing. It also provides information, as I had mentioned earlier. On the negative side, as I said, risk taking may increase, people may may borrow too much. And then, of course, as you saw in the 2008 crisis, when it affects one firm or one bank, it can affect many of them. And that can happen both because they are interconnected, but also they become so opaque and complex that nobody really understands what's going on. And that was part of the problem of the 2008 crisis. Now, again, when we look at volatility, economic volatility, by economic volatility, all we do is look at the standard deviation around growth rates. So we look at how much, in a sense, a measure of how much does GDP growth go up and down, how frequently, because of instability. And what we find, again, is that initially the volatility falls as financial development index increases, so it's better to develop. But then after that, as you become bigger and bigger, the volatility increases. The next chart looks at a measure of financial stability, and the measure that we look at here, it's called a z-score. And all that the y-axis shows, just to tell you in very simple terms, is the lower this number on the y-axis, the lower your buffers are. So what it does is it tells you what is the relationship between the amount of buffers that exist in the financial system relative to financial development. And again, here what we find is that your buffers begin to decline quite a lot as the financial system becomes bigger. Now, one thing I want to point out is that this holds really for only financial institutions' depth of the many indices that I talked about, which was financial institutions and markets, and within that was depth, efficiency, and inclusion. So this relationship only holds for financial institutions' depth. For financial markets, it's a very weak relationship. And for efficiency and inclusion, the relationship does not fall. What does that mean? That means it's always good to become more efficient. And on inclusion also, we don't find that as inclusion goes up, it becomes more unstable. So let me summarize what we learned so far. So basically, what we find is that there is a growth stability trade-off as financial sector develops. In the first part, what you find is the first region where the benefits are greater than risks. These are in the initial stages, and this is where most emerging markets fall and almost all of the low-income countries. The benefits are always greater than the risk because, as you saw, growth is high in the initial phase and volatility is low initially. So both go in the same direction. Then there is a trade-off in the second region as financial development index goes beyond 0.5, where growth remains still high, but volatility begins to rise. And that's where the region where most EMs are and some advanced economies. Then beyond a point, like 0.7 or so, the risks actually are much greater than the benefits. Why? Because both the growth becomes low as well as volatility is high. So that's the key takeaway from the study we did on both growth and stability and its relationship to financial development. So then a question can be asked is, okay, if that's the case, is there some way to push the frontiers, meaning that can we increase this region, the first region, the green region, so that the benefits can be greater than risks beyond 0.5? Are there ways you can do that so that you can develop financial sector even more and yet you don't have to face the risks of instability? So that's what we look at. So what kind of environment do you need for financial development to maximize the benefits of financial development? Now, before we do that, I just wanted to address a couple of questions. We asked the question, does the pace of financial development matter? So here we look at, and this is just looking at emerging markets. So we ask the question, if you develop too fast, so on the x-axis we measure the percentage change in the financial institutions depth, that index. And this will look at only just before the crisis for 5 years. And we look at growth and inflation volatility and also financial stability, what we call distance to distress. And what we find is indeed there's a positive relationship between growth volatility and how fast you grow, meaning the faster you grow, volatility is higher, both for growth as well as inflation. And also, the faster you grow, the faster you deplete your buffers or your distress factor rises. So this is consistent with people who have written about boom and bust. Another question people have asked is, does it really matter whether you develop banks first, let's say, financial institutions, or should you develop financial markets? And this chart on the left-hand side, I'll give you the interpretation, what it shows is that as per capita income rises, initially, you benefit a lot from developing banks and financial institutions. But after a point in time, the benefits from financial institutions begins to fall. The right-hand panel shows, in a way, the opposite, that initially, as you start to develop markets, because markets are very thin, there can be a lot of volatility, there can be a lot of boom and bust, Ponzi schemes. So initially, actually, it can hurt growth. So that's why we find that the contribution to growth falls, but then after a point in time, as markets become deeper, they become more stable, and the contribution to growth rises. And there the relationship, we don't find a turning point here. On this third question of whether the presence of foreign bank matters or not, the red dots, all these dots basically represent countries. Each dot represents country. On the x-axis, we have the share of foreign banks relative to the total assets of all banks. So assets of foreign banks as a share of total bank assets in the economy. And then on the y-axis, we have a financial development index. So we ask the question, is there a relationship? Is it the case that as foreign banks increase, the share of foreign banks, presence of foreign banks, the economy or there's greater financial development? So that's one question we ask. And why do we think, as I had mentioned to you, you expect that there would be greater financial development because they bring capital, they bring know-how. the short answer is there's no relationship. It's all over the map. There's no relationship. So you can develop your financial sector with or without foreign banks. That's what across country data show. Then on the second question, well, but then does it actually hurt? Do foreign banks hurt the economy? And there the red dots matter. The red dots are all the crisis countries. So there again, what you find is that there is no relationship necessarily between the presence or absence of foreign banks. So our key takeaway is that it's not a prerequisite for financial development, the presence of foreign banks, but it's also not, does not lead to a crisis necessarily. So then let me come back to this issue of how can you make sure that financial development takes place safely. So we look at different measures of financial development, and we just run simple regressions against measures such as property rights, creditors' rights, regulatory quality, rule of law. We ask the question whether these things matter for financial development to proceed safely, and there we find that virtually for all indices, the total institutions and markets, everything matters, except in the case of creditor rights and information, it only matters for financial institutions. And why is that? Because, you know, when you're, if it's the stock market or the bond market, you really don't need to know the information of each player. It matters for banks, but not otherwise. And then this was the really interesting finding for us, where we exploited the unique data that we have at the IMF. And this data is, what we do is we've got a program called Financial Sector Assessment Program that we conduct for different member countries around the world. For important countries, systemically important countries, we do it every 5 years. Okay, because it's so intense, it takes at least a year, year and a half to go to a country, look very deeply with a magnifying glass with the financial sector. You know, how's every aspect of financial sector, you know, are the regulations good, are they in place, how's supervision, how are the markets functioning, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, this FSAP, as we call it, Financial Sector Assessment Program, is ongoing for India right now. And it's also ongoing for China. And I'm involved in the China one. So, so I've been working on China for a while. As an Indian, I'm not allowed to work on India. Okay? So, of course, I would have loved to. So here, when we do these assessments, we actually look at about 93 regulatory principles. And we grade each country according to, you know, are they fully compliant, are they partially compliant, non-compliant, et cetera, et cetera. And we get those numbers. So when you get those numbers, and we've done so far, since, and this started since the Asian financial crisis, we've done about 250 FSAPs. So we've got a very rich data set, which we cannot, this is confidential between country and us, this we cannot reveal for individual countries, but we can run regressions and see if there's anything that we find there. And so we have 3 regulatory principles on banking, on insurance, and on securities. And with a total of about 93 principles. We grade each country. And then the yellow dots basically represent the number of principles everywhere. And then we said, let's look at the relationship between the regulatory principles and ask the question whether these principles have mattered for financial stability in those countries. And what we find is that we find that there are certain sets of regulatory principles, and a total of about 1/3 of regulatory principles are really important for financial stability. And that's covered in the red rectangular bar. And then we ask the same question for financial development. Are there regulatory principles that matter for financial development? And we find, yes, there are. And that's covered by the oval blue line. So what are these principles that I'm talking about that really matter for both? So they basically relate to capital requirement, to provisioning, whether there are non-performing loans, how big is the compensation, financial reporting and disclosure, transparency, those are the ones. But what was really fascinating was the fact that, which we hadn't realized, was that it's the same regulatory principles, as you can see by the red and the oval squares and the oval, that matter for both financial stability and financial development, which for us was a surprise. It need not have been. They could have been different ones for both. And intuition probably says they should be different, but they weren't. So it's the same things matter for both. So that's a huge policy lesson for us. So anyway, I'm almost at the end, and I'm just going to summarize broad policy implications. So on the question of whether there's scope for further development of the financial sector, the answer is yes. That's true for many of the EMs, most of them, and virtually all of the low-income countries. But beyond a point, there's a certain trade-off that you saw. Second, I showed you a chart on sequencing where it looked like you're better off developing banks first and then markets. And even though we found that evidence, we can't say with certainty that there's one size fits all. It's just that you have to be very careful. We do know that when banks become too big and the depth rises. And the third question on foreign banks, as I said, it's fine to have them, it's not fine to have them, because at least when you look at financial development or crises. Another set of lessons is, as I pointed out, credit to GDP is not a sufficient measure. You have to look at broader measures. And then we also found that financial inclusion and development is beneficial, but you can reach a point where there is too much credit if regulation and supervision doesn't keep pace with financial development. And then the third one would be most fresh in your mind, because what I just showed of about 93 regulatory principles is the same set which matters for both stability and development. And I thought, let me think of some things I can say about India. Even though in India the financial development is on the high side, it's still kind of protected from what happens, all the exogenous shocks abroad, because there are lots of capital controls in place. If you let go of capital controls, there could be more instability. On the other hand, it also brings benefits, as you know. A second one is, of course, the key point is it's not about whether you should allow foreign banks or not. What is important is competition. And if foreign banks bring you competition, that's great. Okay? And another thing that foreign banks could bring is more transparency, better governance, so which then can be emulated, especially by the state-owned banks, which, as you know, are in trouble a little bit in terms of their very high non-performing loans. And a final one is on the question of regulation. Are there lots of regulations? Is there too little regulation? In India, basically, you'll find lots of regulation in a lot of places. But the point is, you've got to have regulation, but just of the right kind.